Hello everybody and welcome back to War Thunder Mobile. Today we're ranking rank 9s. Let's get right into it. First off, the VCC 8060. The VCC 8060 does not have a whole lot of armor except for these little areas on the turret. Besides that, it is very exposed to being hit. It does have a 2-second reload with an APF SDS round that doesn't have a whole lot of penetration because it is only a 60mm round. And with the somewhat slow reload, it's not going to be good at facing frontline tanks, though you are going to be able to use it in a flanking maneuver along with the pretty much rest of this platoon. This whole platoon shouldn't necessarily be used in direct fire. Do not use it in long corridors or hallways. This thing does have a decent speed and it also carries an HEVT round. From experience, I feel like this HEVT round hits the hardest out of all HEVT rounds, which is very satisfying to get a kill, though it's not as effective as something that can fire more HEVT rounds in a rapid period of time. The Centauro 105R does have Romor A ERA, which does give you additional protection against high explosive anti-tank rounds, ATGMs, as long as they're not tandem, and other such rounds. It does have a very high forward speed. The reverse speed, of course, isn't quite as good. This is extremely good for capturing capture points early on in the game and getting to key sniping positions, because this tank does have a very powerful 105mm cannon that does have access to a decent APF SDS round. Outside of that, it is a very light vehicle and is not necessarily well protected. The VVC Part 2 does not have good protection pretty much at all. It does have somewhat sloped armor on the front, but that's not necessarily going to protect you against anything. This vehicle is, again, really high in its speed, though besides speed, it doesn't offer a whole lot. You can only really use it to fight things that'll be firing missiles such as a BMP-2, like infantry fighting vehicles, and then some anti-airs, especially with how little penetration its rounds do have. The Saddam 25 is a decent anti-air with 0.1 second reload, decent shells that it does carry, and overall okay protection. It does have a pretty high speed, which is good for an anti-air to get to good positions where you're not going to be shot at back while you are killing aircraft. For a rank 9 platoon, it's pretty situational for the vast majority of these vehicles, and because of that, I'm going to give it a 4. Next up, the platoon that I named the best of rank 9 prior, the CV90-105XC8. This platoon also does not necessarily offer a whole lot in armor, though it does have pretty powerful weapons. This particular tank can fire APF SDS and tandem ATGMs, both of which have a 5-second reload. You do have a 10-part autoloader in the back, which is very helpful, and you do have a very high forward and reverse speed, allowing you to quickly get in and out of situations. It does lack in armor, however, what it lacks in armor, it definitely makes up for in firepower. The STRV-105 is a slightly better version than the STRV-104. It has, I believe, a better APF SDS round and the same mobility. You do have a 6.7 second reload, which is about standard for this battle rank, and of course you have some ERA, which will protect you in certain situations. The STRV-9040B has a fairly rapid reload with a 40mm cannon that fires pretty high quality APF SDS rounds. These will be able to shred MBTs from the side. Your turret traverse speed is pretty high as well, which easily allows you to pick off multiple targets at once if you do pull off a successful flank. But then again, of course, because of what it is, it doesn't have much armor at all. The ITP-SV90 is a fairly decent anti-air. The turret is the same as the Chieftain Marksman, if I remember correctly, though the hull for this vehicle is from the Leopard 2. You do have a very rapid reload, not necessarily one of the tanks that I would use for fighting ground vehicles, but in fighting anti-air, it does play very well. This platoon is a little bit better than the prior platoon that we were discussing. However, because of the whole lineup, I'm not going to say it's the best. I do still believe that the CV90 is one of the best vehicles individually, but the platoon as a whole I wouldn't necessarily say is the best, so I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. I remember when the Chieftain Mark 10 came out, it was very trolly due to the additional turret armor, which is not necessarily found on a whole lot of tanks, which has been able to stop APF SDS rounds from hitting the turret, or at least the lower penetrating ones, which is very helpful. The chassis armor isn't necessarily as strong, though you don't necessarily need to show the chassis the entire time when you're playing this thing. And with a 120mm cannon, it does boast some pretty decent firepower. Its speed isn't quite as high as other tanks at this rank, and it does have a slightly longer reload, though what it makes up for that is the protection that you're given due to the composite armor that is on the turret. In a hold down position, this tank plays extremely well. I'd say even better than some of the other Eastern tanks that are at this rank. The turret traverse speed isn't necessarily that fast, but it does make up for that with the amount of protection you have. The Oliphant Mark II has a better reload speed and slightly better speed in general, but you're dropped down from 120mm to having a 105mm cannon. It is slightly better as an MBT, though you don't have the turret protection that the Chieftain has, and instead you have some composite armor, though it's specifically built to deal with chemical energy rounds and not AP rounds, so it's not offering as much protection as the Chieftain Mark X's turret is. Also, with how much of the turret ring is shown, you do have a little bit of a weak spot there, as shots can go right through here to hit your loader and your gunner. The ZT-3A2 has very high mobility and one of the best tandem rounds in my opinion. At least when it came out, it felt like it was extremely good at the time. The reload time is also fairly short, so if there's a lot of enemies in an area that you're around and you don't have to move for any reason, you can easily pick them off really quickly. The ZA-35 is a very interesting anti-air. We do have the cannons that are somewhat similar to the cannons that we can find on the Gepard. Pretty much any high explosive round will easily deal with this tank, and I would use that against it. However, I believe this is one of the fastest vehicles in game, going 132 kilometers an hour. I don't know if it's the fastest, though I do know that this is extremely quick. And of course, with a 40 kilometer reverse speed, you're going to get out of situations in a fairly good time as well. This platoon in total, I'd say, is pretty good. Not necessarily the best by any means, though it does have some pretty well-performing vehicles. I think it deserves a 7 out of 10. The ZTZ96 I had to play earlier today to get more of a refresher on how well this thing does. You do have the Eastern tank reload speed of 7.1 seconds and a 125mm cannon with decent forward speed, not as great reverse speed, but that's kind of expected at this point. You do have a pretty good penetrating armor-piercing APFSDS round, and the turret armor is really good as well. You do have this high level of stacked composite armor, which will help you against any form of high explosive anti-tank. Some ATGMs in perhaps a down tier, as well as some lower caliber APFSDS. The turret to rotation speed isn't that bad, though the lower hull is pretty vulnerable with there being only composite on the upper frontal plate. The CM11 is a very solid tank. It has a 5-second reload and some ERA, which is certainly going to help you in various situations. The ammo is kind of put anywhere after it's filled up in this area, which can hold 33 pieces, and then it's put into the front of the hull. So having it kind of tucked away at first is really good. It is a 105mm cannon, which isn't necessarily standard for rank 9, I believe. And it does not have as good reverse speed or forward speed as the standard Western MBT, though you do have a really good firepower, and for this battle rank, it is a pretty good reload speed. The AFT-09 can die to pretty much any level of high explosive armor. There's pretty much zero protection for the crew inside. I believe even heavier machine guns can easily destroy them, though you do have 4 152mm tandem ATGMs with 1,200mm of penetration. This will easily destroy pretty much any tank you hit, so long as you hit it near the center of mass. The PGZ-09 has pretty much a Gepard type gun on a chassis of a different tank. I don't know what chassis this is, honestly. Very high reload, pretty good mobility in its forward speed, not as much in the reverse speed with the other MBTs that we've been seeing. Back when this came out, it was used a lot in an anti-ground roll. I don't exactly remember if it still holds up to that capability today. Not really something I would do, of course, but if you guys want to, I'd say go for it. This platoon is pretty solid. I'm going to give it a 8 out of 10. The MBT-70, as we've discussed multiple times before, used to be really good with its APFSDS round before the nerf. Now, after the nerf, the APFSDS round isn't quite as good, though it is still a viable option. You do have a 20mm autocannon on the roof, which is very helpful, and you have a 7.5 second reload, which is A little bit longer than most tanks at this rank, though you do have the option to fire a non-tandem ATGM if you want to. What it lacks in firepower, it does make up for in mobility with a 71 km speed in forward and reverse, and you do have some composite armor on the sides. It's not going to necessarily protect you from better tandems or better high explosive anti-tank rounds, though it will probably protect you against lower caliber ones. The M60A3 TTS, one of which I've seen the turret of in real life without the ERA, is really interesting as a tank destroyer. It's a upgrade variant of the M60A1. It's not necessarily as good as the MBT-70. You do have a 105mm gun with a 6.7 second reload rate, which isn't necessarily great, and you do have the... I'm not exactly sure if the M60A3 has the worst APF SDS or if it got nerfed. It might have, though, so it's a little bit risky. The M3A3 Bradley does have a 25mm autocannon as well as a ATGM launcher. The M3A3, which is different from the M3, does have access to both tandems and the TOW-2B missiles. I don't know if the M3 itself has access to tandems, though I do know for certain that the M3A3 has access to both tandems and TOW-2B. It is a very fun vehicle to play, though you do have to wait for the ATGM box to deploy to actually use it, which will slow you down a little bit. And of course, because it is a Bradley, it does have a pretty high turret traverse, which again is very helpful for being in those situations. The M247 at this rank, I believe, I'm not exactly certain, has HEVT rounds, though I might be wrong. If I am, please do correct me in the comments. It has the M60's traverse speeds of the forward 53 kilometers and reverse of 9. It does have a very quick turret traverse speed, though, of 129 degrees per second, which is one of the fastest ones in the game as far as I'm aware. And the SAP rounds on this tank have been killing everything left and right. I think the devs did a fix to this, though I don't know necessarily if it's been implemented fully yet, because I have still gotten some reports from people killing stuff like the mouse with these type of rounds, which they shouldn't necessarily be doing. This platoon is fairly fun to play. The mobility from the MBT-70 and the unique abilities from the other vehicles in this platoon do make it fairly fun. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. It's not necessarily super special, but it is of course fun to play. Next up, one of my favorite platoons, the Leopard 2AV. The Leopard 2AV is a prototype of the 2A4. It's not a 2A5. Someone earlier got really confused thinking the 2AV was a 2A5. It is not. The 2AV has a 105mm cannon, 75 km/h speed in the forward, and 35 km/h speed in the reverse, 6 second reload, and a pretty decent APF SDS round, though it's not necessarily as powerful as the later ones that the Leopard 2A4 get. For this rank, though, it is really good. It does have composite armor on the tank. Now, this composite armor isn't as thick as the composite on the 2A4. However, I believe the actual armor there itself is thicker than the armor on the 2A4. So I might be wrong there. I read that a while ago. It might be misinformation. I'm sorry if it is. I would recommend looking it up for yourself. Now, what the Leopard 2AV lacks in its ability to combat chemical rounds, the CA1 makes up for entirely. This vehicle, which is my favorite in the game, is absolutely ridiculous. It will eat tandem 1200mm penetrating ATGMs like it's nothing and have zero damage done to the crew inside. However, this vehicle has very little protection against APF SDS rounds or pretty much any armor-piercing round. Again, so just to summarize, extremely good against chemical, awful against armor-piercing, which I find hilarious and that's why I love to use it. It is based on a mix between a Leopard 1A3 and a 1A5, so you do have a 105mm penetrating cannon, 6.7 second reload, and a pretty standard set of APF SDS round and chemical energy rounds. However, it doesn't have access to some of the better rounds because it is not a Leopard 2. The M48 Super is a upgraded variant of the M48, which gives it additional protection to the turret in the form of a composite screen. This composite screen allows you to deflect some APF SDS rounds and some high explosive anti-tank rounds. You do have a 6.7 second reload, decent mobility. You actually have a 27 km/h reverse speed, which is better than the standard M48. An okay turret traverse and the decent armor that it does have, making it viable in a hull down, though not your best option. And of course, the Gepard we've gone over multiple times already, so we're just going to skip it for now. The 2AV, personally, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. Now, the researchable German platoon at this level is the Leopard 2K, which offers very good mobility. You have a additional cannon on the top, which is a 20mm autocannon, very helpful. And you do have composite screens which will protect you in certain situations. You have a very high forward and reverse speed, allowing you to easily get around the map and back out of enemy fire when you have to. 6.7 second reload as per standard, and a 57 degrees turret traverse speed, which is very helpful. The KPZ isn't too different from the MBT-70, though you do have a slightly faster reload. I believe the speed is pretty much identical, and the autocannon on top is the exact same. The Begleit Panzer 57 has a 57mm, I want to say autocannon, but it's not an autocannon, it's a Bofors, that has pretty high penetrating rounds. You do have access to not necessarily any form of AP FSDS, though you do have an AP round of sorts, which has APHE, if I remember correctly, and that APHE does have decent penetration, and there is one round that has slightly more pen but less post-pen, and one that has slightly less pen and more post-pen. Personally, I prefer to go with the round that has more post-pen damage, because when you're using this thing to flank, which should be the main thing that you use it for, you do want to deal with the sides of enemies, and having more post-pen damage typically helps with that. However, if you do run into a tank that is in one of those hallway type of areas where you're just out in the open, or you don't have a whole lot of choice except to fight that thing, you do have the option to fire ATGMs at them. I don't believe it is any form of tandem. I do believe they're just standard ATGMs, though they do offer a decent amount of penetration and allow you to fairly easily deal with any targets you're coming across. That, combined with its high speed and very fast turret traverse, makes it a very fun RAP vehicle to use. And then of course the Gepard, which we've already gone over, so we're going to skip it. This platoon is pretty fun, and because it is slightly better than the MBT-70 with the faster reload, I'm going to give this platoon a 8 out of 10. Next up, before we hit the rest of our rarer tanks, except the AMX-40 because I do not have it, we have the T-72A. Recently, I used the T-72A in a hull down only, or at least that was the ideal way to use it, video. And in that video, we showed that the speed on it is fairly okay. In a hull down, it performs decently, though I found the T-64 was better in the hull down position that I was managing to get it into. It does have a 7.1 second reload, making it slightly worse than Western MBTs, though even with that slightly slower reload, you do pack a lot of firepower, which is definitely essential for this rank. With how this particular vehicle is in a hull down position, they're going to have to aim for the driver's port if they want to reliably get a kill. The T-64A pretty much shares the same speed as well as the turret traverse speed, though it does have a slightly different protection scheme. The turret armor isn't as good as the T-72A, though it's not bad by any regard, and you do have these additional flaps on the side which will protect you against any form of high explosive anti-tank or ATGMs. If you do angle them slightly to the side, they do offer more protection, somewhat like this, though they're not going to be stopping any form of AP-FSDS for sure. The BMP-2 has one ATGM launcher and a 30mm cannon, which is also found on the Moderna. I believe this one does carry AP-FSDS, though if it doesn't, it does carry AP-DS rounds, which will allow you to deal with tanks at a somewhat medium distance, and at longer ranges, that might be where you want to use your ATGM. The Sturm S is a fairly odd tank, to say the least, with a 83-second reload, a 130mm cannon that fires ATGMs only, and a pretty interesting set of ATGMs. You do have a tandem ATGM, high explosive ATGM, as well as a HEVT ATGM. Now, I previously believed that this was the only vehicle that had a HEVT ATGM. I was actually wrong. There is one vehicle in the, I believe, Type 74G platoon that also has a HEVT ATGM. However, that makes this the only researchable vehicle with a HEVT ATGM. That particular ATGM allows you to get rid of aircraft pretty much moments after they spawn in during ground matches. If you have line of sight to them and they're flying directly towards the battlefield, you can launch it directly when you see them, and then in about 4 or 5 seconds it'll pop them so long as you know exactly where to aim. This platoon is fairly solid. It's not in one of my top picks. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. The Merkava Mark II-D. Now, I used this vehicle again today as a refresher to see how well it plays. It does have very good mobility in its forward and reverse speed, and of course, because it is a Merkava, you do have the very trolly, massive engine just blocking pretty much any form of rounds from getting in, and that little weak spot that we mentioned prior on the earlier Merkava series is very small on this tank. You do have a decent selection of rounds and a 6.7 second reload with a fairly high turret reverse speed, allowing you to easily deal with targets regardless of what they are. The Sabra Mark I has access to one of the highest penetrating APFSDS rounds, and it has only a 6 second reload, which is very helpful considering that it is faster than most Western tanks and most Eastern tanks. The Sabra also has fairly trolly armor, with it being able to take shots from APFSDS directly to the turret, and it doing not that much damage to the inside components of the tank. I found that out a little while ago when I first used it. It has decent mobility, but of course you're going to want to mainly focus on the firepower, so of course using it hold down would be the ideal. The Magach 7C does not have quite as good turret traverse or penetration, though it does have solid armor on the front, not necessarily just there, but the composite screen does cover up quite a bit. And of course the ammo stored in the hull is a little bit all over the place. A lot of it is stored back here, so if you have those 22 rounds loaded, they're going to be right back over there. They do have multiple machine guns on the roof, allowing you to have some protection against air vehicles. The ZSU 23-4V we've covered multiple times before. We're going to skip it. This platoon is pretty solid. You do have a lot of armor, a lot of firepower, and a more generic option if you do want to use it or if you run out of other options. I'm going to give this platoon a solid 9 out of 10. Not necessarily the best, it does offer a lot of goodness. The FV4033 is not necessarily the best MBT in regard to hull protection. However, it does make up in that in turret protection, which is pretty solid. I know there's a additional plate over that, but underneath it's got some pretty solid composite armor and a 5 second reload, which is very helpful with dealing with enemies. It does have a 120mm cannon, pretty good mobility all around, and of course due to the rounds it has access to, it will easily deal with the enemies that you come up against. The VF-M5 on the other hand has very little protection, though it has very high speed and access to really good rounds. I used this vehicle earlier today to get into a very trolly position and was able to kill 2 vehicles at once, which is very good. It also does show you the capabilities of it. A pretty good turret traverse speed, decent reload, of course it's fairly standard for a Western tank, and overall not that bad. The ZT-3A2 we've already gone over, as well as the ZA-35. I'm going to give this platoon a 8 out of 10. Not necessarily the best, and it's a little bit repetitive, though it is fun to use. The M60 AMBT, this is the American version, by the way, not the Turkish version. I know some people are going to say, oh, it's the AMBT, it's Turkish. It's not, they're actually 2 separate vehicles, because the Turkish one has a 105mm cannon, the American one has a 120mm cannon, with a 6.7 second reload, decent turret traverse speed, and a high penetrating APFSDS round, which has, I believe, 580mm of penetration power. Very good for this rank. I believe the Sabra is the only one at this rank that has about as much for an AP round. Decent mobility all around. It is based on an M60 after all, and you do have some additional armor here with the slat armor helping protect you against some various forms of high explosive anti-tank. Potentially an ATGM, though I don't necessarily see that working so well. The XM8 has a lot of these additional composite screens on it, allowing for a decent amount of protection, though it is still a light vehicle with a 5 second reload. Access to decent APFSDS, it is 105mm of the cannon, and a slightly better turret traverse speed than the majority of vehicles at its rank. Overall, this is a pretty solid vehicle. It is a light tank, so you do have the high mobility, allowing you to easily get around the map, though it only does have a crew of 3. This guy in the front seems a little bit squished, but that's fine. And the gunner and commander being up on the left of the tank. So if one shot goes through, there's a chance that you're going to be only left with your driver, which is not a good situation to be in, especially because that might automatically start a crew replenishment, or maybe not if you don't have that setting turned on. The Bradley we have already spoke on, and the M247 we have already spoke on. The M60 AMBT is a solid platoon. It's a little bit situational because of what it has, though the tanks that it does have offer fairly decent protection. And again, it's a little bit repetitive. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. It's solid, but it's not the best. The T72 AV Terms T. Now, the Terms T does have Contact 1 ERA. Not the best for ERA, but of course it does have a whole lot of it, which is very helpful. A 7.1 second reload and a 125mm cannon do go together quite well. You have a crew of only 3 crew members, though you do have composite armor that is pretty solid underneath your ERA, allowing you to have a pretty solid set of ability to shield yourself from pretty much any oncoming rounds. The reverse speed is awful because it is a T72. You guys are used to that by this point. And the traverse speed isn't necessarily that high, though it does have a very high protection, and that high amount of protection will easily allow you to deal with tanks. This one is one of the more frontline tanks at this rank, I would definitely say, though of course you don't want to necessarily be throwing yourself into the conflict. The TS-25 has access to an APFSCS round, I believe, with 550mm of penetration and a 7.1 second reload. If you took all of the armor off of the terms and just traded it in for speed and firepower, you'd get the 2S25M. So it is very good in this platoon to have such a large difference for that, because if you want to do something heavier, slower, but still decent firepower, you go with the terms. If you want something that is light, fast, and dangerous, you go with the 2S25. And of course, if you want something with a faster reload than the 7.1 second reload that this thing has, you can go with the 2S38. The 2S38 is a ridiculous vehicle. It has 0 crew in the turret, allowing you to easily deal with enemies. And of course, if they do shoot at your turret, the only thing that they can really damage besides your gun is your vertical aiming device. And if they're not going up or down a hill, that's not going to protect them that whole lot. With all the crew being in a hull down position, this thing is insane. Very high forward speed, very quick reload, access to decent turret rotation speed, which is actually really high, and a really good reverse speed for what it is, allows you to easily deal with enemies, plus you got smoke if you really need to back out of a situation. And of course you do have the Sturm S, which allows you to use HEVT ATGMs to shoot down planes, making this pretty much the perfect platoon in my opinion. For this rank, by far, I'm going to say the Terms S is solidly a 10, and there's little doubt in my mind to change that opinion. I hope you guys have enjoyed this ranking video. I enjoy making these to both shed light on the tanks themselves and to get a kind of community census for how we feel about these vehicles. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed, and I will see you guys again soon, hopefully, in the next one.